We've talked a lot on the podcast about the joys of investing in cities like Liverpool and Manchester and Sheffield and others. But what if you're not from those cities? You don't live near them. You've never been there. How do you go from having no knowledge of a city to being in a position where you can confidently invest in property there? Today, we're going to hear from someone who's going through that journey right now. Welcome to the Property Podcast. This is episode 318, where we're talking about starting all over in a new city. There's going to be loads for you to take away from this episode. If this is a process you've already been through, you're going to find yourself nodding along and recognizing a lot of what we talk about. And if it's a process that you're going to be going through, then there's so many great bits of advice from things that our guest did today that you'll be able to take away and use for yourself. And stick around to the end, because if all this research has left you with a million browser tabs open and you're completely losing track of everything, then in Hub Extra, we've got a tool to help you out with that as well. Our news story this week is a big one. The headline in the BBC is "No fault evictions to be banned in England. Private landlords will no longer be able to evict tenants at short notice without good reason under new government plans." Now, this is a big change. This is effectively the abolition of the Section 21 procedure. This is the process that allows you to remove tenants without having to prove that there's anything in particular that they've done wrong. What that means is you'll still be able to remove tenants if they haven't paid the rent, if they've done damage to the property, or if you want to move back into it or you want to sell it. You'll still be able to do that, but you'll have to use the Section 8 process, which involves going through the courts and therefore takes longer. Now, this isn't an enormous shock. Been saying for a while it's likely to happen in England eventually because it's already happened in Scotland. And what happens in Scotland, such as tenant fees being banned, tends to find its way to England eventually. But what is surprising is the timing. Wasn't expecting this to happen now. It's a Labour policy, and it's suddenly been announced by the Conservatives without any real hints that this is going to happen. So the first thing to say about this is don't panic. This doesn't mean that you're going to be stuck with bad tenants forever. And it's also not something that's going to be coming in next week. I think it's going to take quite a while for this to work its way through. At the moment, it's just a proposal. It'll need to go through consultation. It'll need to go all the way through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's going to take quite a while for this to happen. So lots of time to adjust and to plan. So there's not a lot more detail around this because it is only something that's been announced this week. But there's going to be loads of time for us to return to this on the podcast, which we will, of course, do as things develop. And if you'd like to hear more about this story right now, then go and listen to Tuesday's episode of Ask Rob and Rob from a couple of days ago, where in response to a listener question, we talked about this in a little bit more detail. Back in January, we started talking about our hotspots for 2019, the cities that we've got our eye on as good places to invest right now. You can go to the website, do a search for hotspots if you want to find the episode that we did about that. Now, we know from the messages that we've received that got a lot of people thinking and a lot of people diving in and doing some research into some of those areas that we talked about. And one of those people is the producer of this very podcast, Dan. We were chatting off mic about the research that he's been doing into a city that's brand new to him, where he's never invested before, but it's caught his attention. And we thought it would be really interesting to talk through the process that he's been through of getting to know this new city. Because it's daunting. You might have someone tell you that a particular city is great, but a city is a big place. How do you separate out the areas you should invest in from the areas that you shouldn't? How do you establish the buildings that you should be investing in and the strategy that's right for that area? Those are the kind of topics that we're going to get into in this episode. So Dan, you've been investing for a while. You invest in Nottingham and Manchester already. So now you're going for the third out of our 5 hotspots. You're trying to collect the whole set because you've had your attention caught by Sheffield. Talk us through a bit about why Sheffield appeals to you and what you're trying to achieve with your next investment.
Hey, Rob. So yeah, I've been investing in Nottingham and Manchester for a little while now. I'm at a point where I'm pretty happy with my cash flow. So I want to start investing in properties that will ideally have a bit of growth. So I quite like the idea of a well-located apartment. I'm talking something like the outer suburbs of Manchester or the inner city of Sheffield. What I'm trying to achieve is literally just to have a bit of exposure to an uplift in value as the cycle moves towards its growth phase.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm a little bit familiar with your portfolio, so I can say for anyone who's not that you've mainly been going for what you'd call like cash flowing type properties. So your terrace house type situation. I know that you've been doing a lot of work to refurb properties and get their value up. So as a cash flow strategy, makes total sense. But it also makes sense that you're now looking for a different type of stock and a different type of location. Now your needs have changed. We talked about switching strategies before and how that changes over time. So it's good that you've recognized that you're now looking for something different and you're going looking in a different place for it. And Sheffield obviously is one of our hotspots. So I think it's a good place to go looking for it, because with where it is in the property cycle right now, it seems primed not for huge growth in the next year, but over the next 5 years, I think you'd be feeling pretty good about it. So it makes sense that you came to Sheffield. But I'm always interested in how you research somewhere new, like somewhere you've literally never been to before. So what was your research like? Like, did you literally go to Rightmove and type in Sheffield and see what came up? How did you go about figuring out what was what?
Yeah, that's literally what I did. Yeah, Sheffield city centre to be precise. You know, as you mentioned, my portfolio is pretty much low value, high yielding properties. These are properties that I've refurbed, then released the equity before moving on to the next one. Now I'm looking something that's a little bit more hands-off. So now when I go through my search results, I'm looking for anything new or ready to move into, and I'm discarding anything that looks like it needs even a little bit of work. If the kitchen, the bathroom, even the carpets look tired, I moved on, and what was left over was my starting point.
Was that weird for you? Because it's almost like the opposite of what you normally do. Like, I imagine normally you're looking for the dated kitchens and places where you can add some value. Did it take a bit of time to get into the mental habit of looking for stuff that's ready to move into?
Absolutely. I don't even think I'm there yet. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water. I'm used to property that no one wants to move into. It's kind of the thing where I can't make it any worse, and that's always been a little bit of a safety net. But weirdly, for what should be the easiest type of investment, a newish flat, I'm finding that a whole new mentality is needed.
So what kind of price point are you looking at in Sheffield?
Well, that's the thing. I've got a budget of around 70,000, and I've been flip-flopping. Do I buy one outer suburb flat in Manchester, or do I go and see what Sheffield's all about and potentially pick up 2 city centre flats? So it was just a case of playing on Rightmove for a bit. Then I booked in some viewings and made my first trip up to Sheffield to potentially buy a property.
Okay, so you arrived in Sheffield for the first time. What were your first impressions for the kind of properties we're viewing? How did they stack up against what you expected them to be based on Rightmove?
Yeah, to be honest, I was pleasantly surprised. I actually really liked it. I had no idea about size though. I didn't know how long it'd take me to get to each viewing. I didn't know if I should walk or do I hire a car. I was also quite surprised at how big a student town it was and how much of that student community was focused on international students. And everything I saw was pretty new and ready to go. Some places even had a sitting tenant.
And how many viewings did you do that day?
I think it was about 16.
Wow, okay. So the last one's just totally blurred into each other and you have no idea what you saw, basically.
Well, that's it. I find property blur happens whenever you do a day of viewing. However, normally with the stuff I buy, they have distinguishing features like a gaping hole in the wall or some kind of bottomless pit. But because of my criteria of these flats, they were all had a similar look and a similar spec. So it became a bit more about the developments in general. Are they well maintained? Are they well located? Are they near shops or parks or transport links? Just looking for things like that.
Yeah, I guess when you're doing your first trip, for me at least, when you're doing your first trip, it's not so much about the actual units as it is for like fact finding, speaking to people, getting a feel for the area in general. So what kind of conversations were you having with your agents? Because you must have talked to a lot of agents that day as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Normally I have a car going from property to property. This was a bit different. Because Sheffield city centre is quite small, I took a punt and decided to do the viewings on foot. And this actually paid off. It gave me quite a lot of FaceTime with the agents while we're walking between properties, which was like 5 to 15 minutes. And like you said, it became a little less about specific flats and more about the developments and areas. And, you know, I did my best to pick their brains.
And what kind of questions were you asking those agents? And did you get any interesting bits of intel out of it?
In the beginning, I spoke about all the typical stuff like, so how about that Brexit? And then it just started to move on to things like, are you guys busy at the moment? What's the market like? Are you seeing demand? And as you'd expect, everyone is busy. Flats are going like hotcakes. Rental demand is high. Everything's going through the roof. You can't lose here. But eventually, after using what little charm I have, I was able to develop like a bit of a rapport. And that's when I started to notice like some real honesty coming through.
Yeah, it shows how important it is to really dig in and do your research. And it's possible that they just don't even know. If they're just working one day a week or just working Saturdays or something, they might not know about any of this stuff. So it is really important. The other nice thing about once you can build up your own knowledge a bit and you start to get these little tidbits from agents is you can then drop those into conversations with other agents to sound like you really know what you're talking about, which is something I do all the time.
That's exactly it. I was doing my best to use all my newfound knowledge, so at least I seemed like I had a clue what I was doing. You know, in the space of a few viewings, I became a surface level expert on particular parts of the city. It sounds really obvious, but the other benefit of doing that day on foot was just seeing the local area. Normally, I'd just check it out on Rightmove and, you know, make sure it's not across the road from a burning yard of car tyres. But this was a really good way of seeing what neighbourhoods are like. Are they well connected? How far is a Tesco? Is that park over there super ropey, or is it actually quite nice?
Okay, so you get to the end of that first day, all those viewings, seeing a new city for the first time, sitting on the train on the way back. What impressions did you go away with?
Yeah, apart from my brain feeling like a big bowl of spaghetti, the impression I came back with is that Sheffield has so much going on. There's so much development, either just being finished or on its way to being finished, and a lot of it is geared towards students. There's luxury student accommodation, there's student pods, that kind of thing. And I guess for me, it raised concerns about the oversaturation in the market. Is there actual oversupply, and what is that going to mean in the long term?
On the point about oversupply, I think it's something that's natural to be concerned about or to have in your head when you arrive somewhere new and you can see lots going on all over the place. And I think there's a point in the cycle where it's something that you should be concerned about, but that time is not now. A lot of the developments that you're seeing in places like Sheffield and Leeds are making up for lost time. It's where there hasn't really been any development since the crash because everyone's understandably nervous and was holding off for a number of years. But during that time, demand has been increasing. The populations of the city centres has been going up. And as we talked about recently on the podcast, city centre living is a trend. There's more and more demand. So what's being built now is to soak up some of that demand. Even in Manchester, where there's thousands and thousands of units under development right now, there was a piece on the BBC a couple of months ago where they were going around interviewing people about potential oversupply, speaking to people on the ground in Manchester. And it was almost like the angle was they were trying to find that there was this big unsustainable boom. But everybody who they spoke to kind of said, no, this is needed. So many people want to live in the city centre now. So that's Manchester, and I think it's the same everywhere else, especially where from an investor's point of view, so much of what's being built is either just for students or either just PRS, so it's not available for investors to buy. So at the moment, where we are in the cycle now, I can't think of anywhere where I'd be really concerned about oversupply, but I can understand why to you, coming from somewhere where city centre flats aren't something you're used to, why it is something that would strike you straight away and something you'd be concerned about. So you went back for a second visit. What was your plan? What were you trying to achieve with your second trip up there?
Well, the first trip was to get an idea of the city and have a look at the entry-level flats. And like I said, I was thinking I could potentially snag 2 there. But now that I have seen that there is value in the city, I'm thinking of going for one that's a little bit more high-end, that stands out, maybe because it has a balcony or bigger rooms or double bathrooms or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you sent me links to a couple of the things that you were looking at, so I can see they're nice and big and very modern. There's a big balcony there and a nice view by the look of it. And this kind of tells you a lot about where Sheffield is in terms of prices, because this kind of thing in Manchester city centre, as you know, would cost so much more.
Yeah, ambitiously or foolishly, the same day I went to Manchester to do more viewings. Now, instead of city centre, I was in an outer suburb. It was a real illustration to me of how hunting down places a little bit further behind in the growth cycle can make your money go quite a bit further. You can't help but think maybe it was like getting into Manchester a few years ago and just trying to imagine what the value of these flats are going to be in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's almost your insurance against oversupply or saturation or anything else. If you're going for something that's unique or has features that lots of other flats don't, or is nicer in some way, that's always going to stand above. And whereas you get a lot of very boxy one beds or something like that, where it says one of hundreds in a development, and that's where it gets a little bit more difficult, I think. So spending that little bit more can just lift you into a different market and lift you above a lot of the other things that are out there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to say it. On the first trip, everything just blurred together because they looked the same. And I guess they were all the same. On the second trip, the higher end stuff sung out more. There was a bit more to them that made them unique. The other thing of note were the yields. They were much higher in Sheffield than they were in Manchester. And I guess for me, this was also a bit of an insurance where if for whatever reason demand was low, I've got that room to drop the price for maybe 6 or 12 months if I need to. And the property would still yield about 5 to 6% gross.
Yeah, and of course, because of where it is in the cycle, and because prices are so low for the city centre, like one of these that you sent me was like 120 grand for a 2-bed that looks perfectly nice, doesn't need anything doing to it, and this is like the bang in the city centre. So because prices are so low, you don't have to break the bank to get something that is a little bit nicer and stands out. And those low prices are what causes that higher yield, and that's a kind of a signal that there is room for prices to grow, because that yield will eventually get compressed kind of down to the levels of cities that are further ahead, like Manchester or Birmingham.
That's exactly what I've seen in Manchester. Because Sheffield and places like it, they're a little bit further back in the cycle, there's a bit more opportunity to try and lock in a good yield. Like we touched on earlier, it could be like getting into Manchester a few years ago or even London before that.
So you've been up there a couple of times now. You've seen a lot of stuff. You can convincingly blag your way through a conversation as a local expert. Where's that left you? What are you thinking now?
Well, now it's a case of choosing. Do I go for a blue chip area in Manchester? It's fine, it's safe, it'll give a good return. That's all fine. Or can I push everything a little bit harder in Sheffield and get a bit of a higher return? I guess for anyone who's listening, it probably sounds like a total no-brainer. I think for me, it's a case of removing the last bits of emotion and getting to grips with trying to understand a new city. And I think with a few more visits under my belt, hopefully it won't be too long till I know it as well as I know Manchester.
So we've talked a lot about Sheffield in particular in this episode, but this isn't really about Sheffield. This is about starting over in any new city. And there's so much of Dan's experience there that you can probably relate to if this is something that you've done recently. And if it's something that you're thinking about doing, then there's loads of lessons in there and tips that you can use. What I really liked is it was a real illustration of like working down through the levels and zooming in, I like to think of it as. So you start off by literally going into Rightmove and typing Sheffield City Centre, going as broad as you possibly can just to get that feel of what's out there and what everything looks like at different price points, going into the map and seeing how prices change in different areas of the city, getting a feel for that kind of thing. Then actually going there, viewing a whole lot of stuff, getting more of that ground level information and speaking to agents to find out more. In cities where you can do this, as Dan discovered, being on foot is great because it does give you more time with the agent. When you're just kind of turning up and they're opening the door for you and standing there while you have a 5-minute whiz around, it is difficult to get much more information and build up that rapport. If you're walking between different properties, that gives you so much more time to pick up these little bits of knowledge. And as we said earlier, you can then drop those little things into the next conversation to get more insights and then just kind of roll it on until you really do have that block by block level knowledge. And I think it was interesting as well to hear Dan's concerns around oversupply, because it's not something that I massively think about. I own flats in locations where loads and loads of new stuff has been built around mine and it hasn't really affected me at all. But I can see why Dan's more concerned about it, because it's just more visible when you're talking about city centre flats, and he's coming from a type of stock that's so different. Like I said, I think there's always going to be a demand for all types of property at all kinds of price point. The insurance is to buy something a bit more high end, so it stands out more, or to buy something new. But if you are buying something existing, then the quality of management is so important. And as Dan discovered, that's not something that's necessarily obvious at first glance. And so really taking the time to do your research and go back and look again and again at different flats at different times of day with different agents can help you to pick up on those clues. And that's another takeaway, I think. Dan did so much groundwork here. He did so much research before he went. He did a couple of really long days up there. And that's what you should be doing. If you're doing this yourself rather than getting somebody else to help you out with sourcing, then it is going to be a lot of work. But that's okay. It's just part of the process. And even though it is a lot of effort, it does involve long days and lots of traipsing around and lots of conversations. It doesn't actually take that long until you are in a position where you've got a good base of knowledge and you get to that point where when something new comes onto the market, you kind of know what it's all about. You've got that knowledge there and you don't have to start again from the beginning. You can have a feel quite quickly for if it's well priced and if it's the kind of thing that you're going to be interested in. I'm sure that if you are looking at a new city now or you're planning on doing so soon, there's loads in there that you can take away and use. Okay, so thanks to Dan, there's been loads of value in this episode, but let's see if we can pack in a little bit more before the end in the form of Hub Extra. This is where every week we give you that little bit more, whether it's a quote, an app or tool, something to make your life a little bit better. And it's all backed up by the Hub Extra email that you'll get in your inbox on a Friday morning if you're a Property Hub member. This week, Hub Extra is a tool, and it's a tool for you if you end up with about 30 different tabs open by the time you've been at your laptop for an hour. And if it's like grinding to a halt because you've got so much open, and if you've got about 10 things pinned for later because you don't want to lose them, I'm sure there's a lot of people in that position. Now we all spend so much time in our browsers. The tool is called Workona. It's completely free. And what it does is it allows you to arrange your tabs into different workspaces. So if you're doing multiple different activities, you can have a group of tabs for each. So you could have one for your work. You could have another for your personal life. You could have another specifically for researching properties. You could even have one for your research in Sheffield and another for your research in Manchester. So you can break it up into different groups. And then when you go into one group, it hides all the others. So you don't have this overwhelm of having a million things open, all with like about 3 pixels each, trying to work out what it actually says. And you could also take a whole group and suspend those tabs so they're not taking up memory and causing your computer to grind to a halt. So this is an extension for Chrome. So if you're in Chrome all day and you end up with far too much going on, Workona is well worth checking out, and you'll find a link to that in the show notes. So that is us done for this week. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know what you thought of this episode. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Property Hub UK. And if you'd like to know what Property Hub has to offer you beyond the podcast with all our services and free tools, then join us on our next Discovery Tour. You can find a link to sign up for that at propertyhub.net/discover. We'll see you again on Tuesday for Ask Rob and Rob. Until then, have a great week. Bye-bye.